The more I learn about consciousness, the less I'm sure it exists.
Who are you?
I'm a neuroscientist that helps you understand your brain. ADHD is a natural phenotype. It's like being bald. It happens. It's a natural thing. You'll see some people these days, a couple of people out there in the talking head space are saying, oh, ADHD is caused by trauma. No, it's actually a normal variant of human, but it does make you more vulnerable. You don't have to get to the diagnosis. People are not their diagnoses. I'm not like, oh my God, you have ADD. I'm like, okay, would you like to sustain your attention better? The question isn't, do you have ADHD? The question is, what are your goals around that brain? Do you care? Does it work for you? Do you want to be more focused? Seeing your brain, seeing even suffering, it does create this different relationship with yourself. People cry when I show them their concussion or their tinnitus or their OCD. They're like, oh my God, yes, thank you. Mom, look, it's real. All the ancient stuff we've been told for 5,000, 10,000 years, guess what? It works.
Do you believe in God?
I don't.
Welcome to today's episode of Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Cameron Edward Benton, and on today's episode, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Andrew Hill. Dr. Andrew Hill is a PhD in cognitive neuroscience out of the University of LA, and he is the founder of Peak Brain Institute, where he's done over 10,000 brain maps, whether that's helping somebody with addiction understand their neurodivergence with ADHD, or helping high performers achieve an even higher level of performance. In this episode, we talk about his journey into neurofeedback, dealing with his own ADHD, how he did some of the first research, double-blind, placebo-controlled, around the attention networks in the brain as it relates to neurofeedback, how he helped people with autism get better for the first time in a short period of time, as well as what it looks like when you are mapping the brain of a self-proclaimed psychic while they are doing their quote-unquote psychic thing. One of the things I'd really love for you to listen to in this episode is Dr. Hill's deep sense of compassion. He has this really fun and delightful curmudgeonly Gen X exterior, and then yet underneath that there is also this whimsicalness, this sensitivity, this depth and wonder and humility towards the world around him that centers around his huge desire to reduce human suffering wherever and whenever possible. So without further ado, here's getting to know Dr. Andrew Hill. Who are you?
Who am I? I'm Andrew Hill. I'm a neuroscientist that helps you understand your brain. A lot of my reason for being is to help people demystify themselves and look at brain data and try to figure out things that we give labels to, diagnoses to, suffering, goals, but you can actually understand a lot more about yourself than most of us realize. And so I teach people to look at themselves and often take control of making change from that perspective about how their physiology is working.
You said demystifying themselves and their brain. Can you share a little bit more about that? What does it you feel like needs to be demystified?
Yeah, we all, I think, suffer with or experience at least different resources throughout the day, throughout the week, things involving managing stress, attention, executive function, emotional resilience, speed of processing, how well we sleep, how well we wake up. And these are resources that get cramped up, just like a shoulder can get torn or a low back can get spasmed. You can have your posterior cingulate cramp up in high gear, and now your brain is stuck in this mode where that resource is always active, just like a cramped up muscle. In this case, the posterior cingulate does environment sampling and evaluation, like watch the road, heads up. It's like part of the brain that's sort of helping you orient yourself to what you must pay attention to, essentially. And if you learn the world isn't safe or predictable, it cramps up into high gear because the cost of missing danger is so high. I mean, you miss that tiger once, if you're lucky. So we end up having labels for an overactive, let's say, in this case, posterior cingulate, and that would be given names like rumination or maybe PTSD if it's really cramped up in high gear. But while the label's important and useful and the set of things that come along with complaints are really valid, it's not the only landscape is, oh my God, something's happening to me. It has letters attached to it. It's got a label. There's also, what is your brain actually doing? What is the physiology? What's the resource? And dysregulations in those resources create a lot of suffering. And so you can look at a lot of the things we carry around and kind of decompose them into the base resources that might be dysregulated or not operating how you want, and then make some change there.
Is neurodivergence real?
Sure. People are weird. I mean, being weird is probably more normal than being normal. There is no real average person, So you'll find that by very definition, humans are variable, and average is about 2/3 of people and the rest are weird. Doesn't always get in the way. It can. And you'll find that in complaints like psychiatric stuff, the incidence of neurodivergence is much, much higher than in the background population, but doesn't mean that neurodivergence leads to problems. It just leads to difference.
Is it true that like being neurodivergent can have or does have superpowers, or do you feel like it's...
Sure, it can. I mean, pattern matching, speed of processing. Based on the individual, you may have things like really crazy verbal fluency or perfect pitch. Like you can have a bunch of interesting, quirky features in the brain. And the more weird you are, the more weird you are. So you tend to get multiple flavored things. And like you tend to be left-handed and clumsy and gay and stutter and autistic. Like, not everyone's all those things, of course, but like you tend to get clusters of weirdness showing up in one individual. And there's a reason for that. It's not because it's like, oh, whoops, we made a mistake. No, the patterns actually cohere. You tend to have people that have the executive function areas, the front and back midlines, the behind the right ear, like that gifted poet brain, that anxious but brilliant individual. That's a thing. It's a human, variant that shows up. It's unusual. But so is like being left-handed. That's like 10 to 15% of the population. Right. It still happens though after millions of years. So it's probably doing something real.
One of the questions I was curious about as you talked about sort of fixing dysregulation or helping the brain regulate is, how do we know when something is dysregulated versus just different?
Well, if it's in the way, it's dysregulated, basically. There's a certain, psychology, diagnostic language psychology, or even medicine would often put the diagnostic threshold sort of when you're far enough away from average. But brains are too weird to do that. When you're thinking about physiology itself, you can't say, oh my gosh, something's unusual, therefore it means X or Y or Z. You can say, oh, look, part of your brain's unusual. And that often means, or here's a plausible interpretation of what it means. Like I mentioned that posterior cingulate, stick with that one example. If you see a lot of beta waves, like 2-3 standard deviations more beta waves, which is like an activated information processing wave, in that tissue at rest in somebody, it's plausible they have a heightened threat sensitivity, they ruminate, they have some fearfulness. It's also plausible that they're a very skilled lifeguard, or a mom with 6 kids, and it's a well-regulated sampling and evaluation. It's a trained resource instead of an overactive resource. So you have to go through this step when doing work on people's brains, where you first start off with the actual physiology and extrapolate from that what might be going on, instead of starting off with a symptom list or a set of diagnostic criteria and trying to fit, because people are not diagnoses. They don't fit the buckets very well. And so you'll see features that might be anxiety or ADHD or, depression or mood stuff, but it's not a perfectly diagnostic landscape. So just like you looked at your lipid panel maybe and saw some triglycerides, a little cholesterol, you kind of know what it means, but it isn't always perfect. And instead of using it to go, oh my gosh, it's above some threshold, I have to take statins, you go, ooh, maybe I better back off in the Ben and Jerry's. And you use it for agency, make a behavioral change, and learn to steer the system. And so you can do a lot of that with the brain around especially sleep, stress, and attention. And there's a bunch of other stuff you can also pretty reliably make changes in that are higher level and more mysterious things.
Yeah. I mean, when you say that, part of what I start to hear is there's a big difference between the diagnosis and the symptomology of something and maybe what's going on underneath the hood, right? So there is maybe some 5 or 6 different people who are maybe diagnosed with ADHD, but they all might actually have something different that's causing those symptoms. Is that accurate?
Yes. But 1 or 2 of them is going to be misdiagnosed if that's the case. If you had let's say 10 people with ADHD diagnoses, you'll have 20% of them, it's actually a sleep issue. And 1 or 2, it might be an anxiety phenomena manifesting with some disinhibition or impulsivity. But the bigger theory is that the components of executive function that might be labeled ADHD, those are pumping the gas, vigilance, focus, initiating behavior, and pumping the brakes, impulsivity, stopping the release of behavior. And those are big, gross resources in the brain, the initiation and the inhibition of action at the sort of mind-body intersection. They're the precentral gyrus, just the most posterior part of the frontal lobe on both sides. The one on the left acts like the driver in the car, activates, it just stays on the road even if things are boring. It helps you, do the task even if you're not that excited about it. It sort of maintains the mode you're in. And the one on the right supervises, reads the map, helps you decide, how we're turning a head up here kind of thing. So it's doing this sort of left and right hemisphere stabilization and supervision. If you see those tissues being really off in somebody, having instead of lots of robust beta, having alpha waves, a drifty wave in the left, or theta waves, a release of inhibition, like taking your foot off the brakes on the right, you tend to get inattentiveness when the stabilizer can't be stable, and impulsivity when the supervisor is going squirrel and being reactive to information instead of steering the whole machine. If you see high theta and high beta or high alpha in these tissues in somebody, do they have ADHD? They're certainly behaving like it. And something like 95% of the people, if it was a kid, you'd be able to diagnose just off the data. The problem is that a certain number of those people are going to have that behavior, but it's from a sleep issue. It's from COVID. It's from a concussion. So the diagnostic label is not as precise. ADHD specifically is 18 characteristics, 9 and 9. And it's a behavioral observed diagnosis. ADHD is one of the few diagnoses you can do at a distance.
Just to clarify on that, when you say like different characteristics, are you talking about like behavioral characteristics or characteristics within the brain itself?
For the DSM, the psychology manuals, is 18 factors you have to observe in behavior. Difficulty sitting still, waiting your turn, that kind of stuff. And they have to have existed for a long time, since childhood, across domains of life. And there's some that are the gas pedal ones and some that are the brakes, the activation and the inhibition ones. And depending which difficulty you have, you get labeled as inattentive, impulsive, or combined now. Years ago, we had this label ADD, and it's still in our colloquial language, but there hasn't been an actual ADD diagnosis since 1987.
Wow.
That's when the diagnosis was retired. So everything's a variant now of ADHD. It's hyphen, combined, mixed, inattentive, etc.
Fascinating.
So you can see in someone's brain, if they have lots of issues with beta on the left, they're going to have some inattentiveness often. And on the right, impulsivity often. So what you do is you do not just the brain mapping, the measurement of the EEG, but you also measure the performance, measure the attention performance. So if those things line up really, really well, you're inattentive and you have tons of alpha on the left, you're impulsive and you have tons of theta on the right. Well, then guess what? You're performing inattentively and with impulsivity. Your brain looks like it often looks in ADHD. The question isn't, do you have ADHD? The question is, what are your goals around that brain? Do you care? Does it work for you? Do you want to be more focused? Because if you do, you don't have to get to the diagnosis. You're getting to the brain resources. So you get to drop away, in some ways below the level of diagnostic language, but also you move away from it. It's not, do I have ADHD? It's more like, hey, the left side of your brain's beta tone looks a little bit weak. Often that means people drift and can't stay on task if they're bored and kind of wander, have a hard time starting activity. Oh, that sounds important to you. Okay, well, that's probably valid. Here's a trick. The left side, or a feature that you can kind of predict, that left side beta, it doesn't just stabilize attention, it also stabilizes the depth of sleep. So you can take that valid measurement of performance on a behavioral test, the theory about the alpha you saw in the brain, and then go, oh, if this is inattentive, it often comes along with a sleep maintenance issue. Are you having trouble staying asleep, waking up tired every morning? Oh, you are. Well, okay. So you can start to paint out the corners progressively by looking at features. And while brain mapping or QEEG is hard to interpret, as you're probably understanding, it's a stable set of resources. So a map on you today and in a month and in 2 months and in 6 months would be the same, barring doing things to your brain that made changes.
Yeah.
So you get this trait measurement at a high level where you can start to get a sense of sleep, stress, attention. And, 10 people with ADHD, again, there's some diagnostic, overuse of those labels, but people are not their diagnoses. They're not just ADHD. If they have it, they're also, most ADHD has a sleep component to it. The primary brainwave on the right, that precentral gyrus on the right, uses something called sensory motor rhythm to sit still and to supervise behavior, to inhibit or pump the brakes gently and help us steer our behavior. And sensory motor rhythm, SMR, is also called sleep spindles when you're asleep. So when you hear a dog bark from 3 miles away and you're asleep and you know that dog so you don't wake up, or a car goes by and you ignore it and stay asleep, a burst of SMR, a burst of sleep spindles happen to keep you asleep, to inhibit the system. And SMR is also what you see if you look at a cat on a windowsill watching birds, that laser-like focus and completely liquid, still body. That state, motorically, physically still, and cognitively locked in with your attention, that's literally the opposite of ADHD. Literally. Where the SMR tone is low in ADHD, so the theta takes over and information pulls attention, pattern, stimulus, intensity pull the attention, instead of you inhibiting and driving the attention from the inside. That's what ADHD really is. So if you see this in somebody, it doesn't matter if they have the diagnosis. If they have the brain patterns and they have the performance difficulty or just the goal, then you can pursue change without worrying about putting it in this diagnostic landscape necessarily.
So one of the things I thought of as I'm hearing this is, people are able to, change their brainwaves, change themselves in a sense, like in the way that they want to. And what I'm curious about is, let's take this person with ADHD, for example, and training the SMR frequency. Are they losing anything by making the shift? Is there always some sort of trade-off that we have to figure out? Okay, am I willing to be little bit less creative, maybe to, but like get some more, impulse control with that? Is there always that trade-off that's happening that we're making decisions about, or how does that work?
Almost never is there that trade-off when you do things properly, because you're not taking somebody from one set of brain resources and moving them to the other side of that brain, activation state. You're really doing a ranging process. So somebody with ADHD can still become the best person on the sport pitch or the video game competition. And they can also decide to focus under low intensity environments like history class. You can decide to turn the resource on. That's the biggest difference. Or in the case of OCD, you can give somebody the ability to hyper focus if they wish, or decide to put that down reliably if they would rather not right now. And that doesn't take away the hyper focus. People with ADHD and OCD often ask me that exact question. Hey, I like how I am when I'm playing football, baseball, video games, playing music, doing my taxes for the person with OCD. I love it. I don't want to lose that. I'm like really, really good at that. Okay. Well, you tell me if you need more of that push in that direction, but I think you can just get a range, and now you can decide to use the resources. It might help to know that a lot of the things that I work on that are considered psychology problems or disease process, mental illness, I don't consider them disease processes. They're really phenotypes and dysregulations. They're patterns that naturally exist. ADHD is a natural phenotype. It's like being bald. It happens. It's a natural thing. There's probably some reasons for it evolutionarily. It's not a huge percentage of the population, but it seems to keep persisting. And so there's got to be some adaptation there. And you'll find that these phenotypes of people that have a hot anterior cingulate, so they hyper-focus and get stuck in their head, or have a hot right tempo parietal junction, so they're drinking in the world's emotional sensitivity and all the information in the sensory and emotional world. There's reasons for having those brains.
What is a phenotype?
Phenotype is an appearance. Blue eyes, brown hair, short, tall. The genotype or the genes, the phenotype is the expression that you see of that genes, and that label's been extended into other things that tend to have presentations. So we have phenotypes of EEG. So if I measured your brain at rest for 10 minutes, eyes closed, and then compared you to the average person your age, you're going to be different in certain ways. Maybe you're going to have lots of beta over that right side. Maybe you're going to have an alpha speed that on a bell curve is a little faster or a little slower than the average person. Or when you close your eyes, you're not as good as the average person at shutting off the visual tissue, or you're better than average at shutting off the visual tissue. And you'll see this on like big activation patterns, maps we call them, which are like little heat maps showing color-coded patterns that are stable for you. So again, if you had, let's say, a front midline theta, which would show up if somebody had a lot of songs stuck in their head or a lot of nail biting or picking at things, that's a particular phenotype you tend to see of front midline theta. Kind of like the low-key OCD variant stuff tends to show up with, especially songs in our head. It can be really aggressive. And you don't know if it means someone is biting their nails or has songs in their head if you see front midline theta, but it's pretty plausible. And hey, let's talk about it. Let's see if it's dysregulated or if you're just weird. If you're weird, great, good job, be weird. Like, you don't really care. The goal is not to get you to the middle of the bell curve. That's the thing people often miss when thinking about what is this brain mapping stuff or neurofeedback. We're not training you to the middle of the bell curve. We're using brain mapping to figure out how weird you are, because that matters, because it'll unpack interesting things about you. And then you want to design the interventions against the person or to the person you're actually working with. But you don't want to sort of say, the goal is to push you toward the middle of the bell curve. And so somebody could have tons of theta on the right, really, really low SMR tone on the right. But if we do a performance test and they have good control over impulsivity, it's not in the way. It's normal for them. And so I wouldn't, if I saw low SMR, I wouldn't say, are you impulsive? Because we just measured it and you're not. I would say, ooh, SMR tone's kind of low. That can sometimes mean it's hard to relax your body, some body tension, or it's hard to fall asleep at night. I'm trying to figure out maybe if it mattered. And if it didn't, it didn't. So that's the hard part of brain mapping, is that it's kind of accurate, like it's stable, but it's not diagnostically precise. Because people are not the same. They're quite variable. So it ends up being the kind of the sort of joke I tell is that if we're doing our job right, looking over brain maps, I'm not telling you anything new at all. I'm saying, hey, here's a thing, and it often means this, and the person's laughing. Oh, okay, that sounds like you. Okay, there it is. Isn't that cool? You can see your impulsivity, anxiety, sensory stuff, whatever. And it also gives you a different contextualization. Like if you have, there's a big chunk of tissue behind the right ear that brings the world in, the sensory world, the social world, called the right tempoparietal junction. I call it the princess and the pea because it tends to be like, things are irritating. People's voices, eye contact, lights, sounds, sensory things, etc. And if yours is a little bit wide open, a lot of beta waves, maybe some low alpha, I can predict you're going to have a little bit of maybe raw kind of emotional processing. Your empathy is a bit too wide open. You feel the world's pain. You're a poet. You're kind of suffering. I can't tell. It might be true, but maybe you have a lot of social anxiety. Or maybe eye contact is super stressful because it's intense. I don't know that from the brain, but I do know this part of the brain is kind of quirky. Hey, let's talk about this part of the brain. It's a little unusual. It's kind of cool. Here's how it works. And if we're doing our job right and not reaching for things in the data, then, out of the 5 or 10 things we find for each person, most of the person's like, wow, yeah, you can see that thing about me? That's kind of cool. And we're often looking for or finding things that are a little bit of suffering or complaints. People try to fix problems. But seeing your brain, seeing even suffering, ADHD, anxiety, whatever, it does create this different relationship with yourself, because it's not a diagnosis being given to you. It's not a disease happening to you. It's part of your brain, part of your body. And so seeing it in data is kind of like seeing your torn shoulder on an x-ray and going, ooh, that frustrates me. But you're not guilty about your shoulder. You're not ashamed. You're not overwhelmed. It hurts. It's annoying. The suffering's real. But the secondary suffering we have for cognitive things and emotional things and psychiatric things, because they're a little bit invisible, because they're happening in a way that no one else can see, and because we don't understand them deeply, I think that's really something that QEEG or brain mapping can help us demystify, and that flips the script and gives us control, gives us agency. over ourselves.
A lot of what I hear in that, right, is this ability to eradicate shame around a lot of these things too, right? What I hear in some of this is, and I know, somebody who was later diagnosed with ADHD in my life, the amount of times I was told to focus more and beating myself up because I didn't do a thing or whatever it might be. And there's so much like inner morality that we can hold with some of the things, especially in our society, which very much prioritizes, if you can focus for a long time and work out one project for a very long time and do this one thing, then it's like, well, you're either a good person, you're a good person if you make a lot of money by doing these things, versus like even having a wide stance of what, is good or not. And then also being able to see like, this is actually just like a fundamental wiring, or there is literally a torn shoulder here. I mean, I know that you've worked with a lot of people with, TBI, which is traumatic brain injury, for example. And like, you can see how much somebody can just drastically change with an injury like.
Yeah. And it's also, by the same token, over a few months, sometimes you get changed subjectively, you remap, and that also provides that sense of like, okay, I do trust how I feel. I do feel better. Okay, I can now trust my new baseline. So it does help to remove that shame. I got to tell you, just learning about the brain. I mean, I'm a neuroscientist and I know, a fair amount about the brain. Also super ADHD. Used to be a lot more, like until my mid-20s, it was about the worst case that exists on the planet. And I did some neurofeedback and pulled it back down to a low squirrel. But when I was learning about inhibition and executive function more deeply, I started to hear my parents' admonitions from childhood: think before you speak, think before you speak. And I realized, well, wait a minute. Okay, nothing was happening here before. I didn't have that moment of sampling and inhibition to decide to think before I spoke. It was more of an automatic, responsive, reactive mode when I was a little kid. And so learning that in college or grad school was like, oh, okay, yeah. So that's how I worked. And there was a huge amount of frustration that I had, that my parents had, because that seemed to be a reasonable thing to keep asking. If we keep asking him to not be impulsive, of course he's not going to be, because his siblings can. And the physiology, understanding the physiology gives you a little more permission to, live how you are, I think. So.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that comes up for me too is just, I often think about just the amazing access of internet information that we have. And, there's the goods and bads that come with that stuff. I think a lot more recently, we tend to demonize all of our technologies that are coming through because we're, I think, almost going through a colloquial or large scale dark night of the soul in some ways. But I think, we've been exposed to so much more information. And I look at my parents and my mom, who using a Word document can be very challenging for her. And I think about, wow, there's I think one of the things we don't really realize often is how vast our generational gaps are because of the exponential curve of technology over the last several decades. Like even the gap between, me as a millennial and Gen Z. I don't know if you've heard this before, but there's kind of a joke that like millennials are the only ones who know how to work computers because my parents, are all too old to know how to do it. And
Gen X, man, we had to do it all.
There you go.
We can both work on computers and we can jump a car and we can come home with no one home and
Yeah, exactly.
Gen X, the transitions, and you guys, you can work computers, but you can't do other things. Like you couldn't like time a carburetor.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then we have Gen Z who, they've had apps ever since they were kids. So like they don't know how to just do some basic troubleshooting on a computer. That seems so obvious to me and other people I know.
And that is accelerating. I would argue that our grandparents were, less advanced than our parents, less advanced than us. Like as we stretch back in time, the gaps are bigger because of that exponent. So, think about it. 50 years ago, there weren't gyms on every corner. 50 years before that, we didn't think about physical fitness at all. Yeah. And now you can go and get your full genome sequence for a couple $100 and look at your APOE4 and look at your risk factors for methylation and dial it all in. And that's useful. And it's useful for our grandparents and our parents as well. I mean, my mom calls me and says, hey, what are the good nootropics? Could you send me some? And I'm out of my choline. Send me some piracetam. And she's 75, 76. She just got back from traipsing around the Antarctic, counting penguins.
Wow.
Like,
is that because
there's a lot of variability depending how we engage. But if you go back a 50 years, a previous generation, that was really rare. We aged faster. So I think we've been I taught gerontology for a while at UCLA, so I have to get all geeky with the language. But there's something called compression of morbidity.
What is gerontology?
Oh, the study of aging.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. So we have this idea in healthy aging and peak aging of compression of morbidity. We have a trajectory of aging. Our bones get less dense, our minds get less sharp, et cetera. And we don't really ideally want that to be a long, slow process, 30 years of slowly dying. We want to kind of keep that curve flat. And then at the very last moment, everything should fall apart, right? Right at the very, we want to die right at the very end of our life, not for 30 years.
Right.
And that's what's been happening. Bone density, cancer, diabetes, a lot of chronic treatment and acute illness treatment has been really advanced a lot in the past several decades. And so you see this happening in cultures across the past several hundred years, that the population starts off as a pyramid with lots of young people and very few old people. And as the causes of death start to change because of medicine and hygiene and things, you get this more column shaped, where you have as many old people as you do young people because of survival through childhood. And then we have things in the US, often called the pig and the python, this lump in the column, which was the baby boomers. Too many of them, twice as many were born because of the war. Then there's the echo boom, which is also Gen X. The children, and so you can see these little lumps in the pyramid. But as that starts to happen, you end up with this kind of shape going on, where this is what's happening now. You have the elder communities becoming a larger percentage than the youngers. And that is because we're taking health and pushing it out longer and longer and longer into the end of life. So I do think that is our responsibility to take control over that particular trajectory individually, but it seems to be happening broadly as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I noticed that I thought about in the back of my mind, and then I saw a quick reel on it one time, and there is a distinct difference between how I look at 36 compared to the average 36-year-old and what they looked like when I was growing up. Even I think about my parents when I was a kid, and sometimes I think, oh, maybe it was just because I was younger and I had this idea, but then I look at old photos and I'm like, oh, wow, they look so much older for their age than we do now.
Not just that, in the late 60s, it was a trope to not trust anyone over 30. 30 was considered that cutoff. If you're over 30, then some of it was that you were generationally different, right? Because you have the young boomers and the old boomers. The young boomers are the older generation, the older boomers born earlier are like the Leave It to Beaver family, the sort of white picket fence. And the second half of the boomers were the hippies and the Vietnam War and all the big cultural change we had in the 60s and 70s are from that group. But they're not the same group. One group had, white picket fences and a pocket watch when they retired and a very certain type of economy. And the other group was going through chaos as they moved into their adulthood, reshaping the whole country. And I sort of feel like now we're kind of like where we were 50 years ago, where there's this swirling, bubbling, identity shifting thing. Yeah. And I think that just like technology is accelerating, I also think the ability for cultural ideas and transformation and growth to move through the whole world is also much higher because of technology, because of communication. Yeah. So you get this sort of democratization of transformation because people can access information, they can learn things, they can, it's less controlled by a particular news outlet or government state. So I think that's a very interesting thing, but I do think that, this transformation we are seeing is still, I'm in my 50s. There's definitely generational differences that look very similar to 50 years ago when it was like, kids these days.
Oh yeah, totally.
There is some of that still exists. So,
Absolutely.
We haven't become homogenous through tech yet.
Yeah, I think that is like an almost an inevitability. I was talking to somebody before about just video games. I'm a big video gamer, and there's that same thing within the video game culture where it's like, I can't believe that this stuff is just accepted by everybody in their school. It was such a niche thing when I was growing up. or you were a nerd or whatever, unless you played sports games and then you're just like part of that world or whatever. It's just a casual thing you do. But like I've talked to friends who are Gen Z that are telling me about some indie game that they played, and they only play casual games. I'm like, I cannot imagine a normal person like you ever being into this stuff in the same way that I am, but you are, right? Because it's the generational gap has changed so much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Curious to see what happens next.
Always more on the horizon. Well, how do you see AI affecting our brains?
I mean, I think it's interesting in terms of where it will go. I think it will affect us a lot more than most things ever have in technology. Like, I don't think we have any clue yet what's going to happen. I think the world's going to be different in 10 or 20 years in a way that we just have no concept of. The same way that had you told me how much a cell phone was going to change the world 50 years ago, 30 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you. Having a phone in your pocket can't be that transformative. Why? But it's so much more than that. It's a lifestyle. I mean, as you said at the beginning of the show, we have entire generations that can use a phone, but can't, use a Word document. At both ends of the age spectrum, right? My mom's better at her phone than she is at her Mac, So I think that AI is going to change technology, which is going to change our world dramatically. But I think that AI is also creating, I think we're moving into a place where we're not yet to general intelligence. We're not yet to true artificial intelligence. But we are past the place where we are presented with the uncanny valley. We're past the place where we can chat with a chat GPT and feel weird about it. Now we're at the place where we can chat with an AI and feel connection and feel relational. And, there's stories of teenagers talking to like personality AIs and getting like overwhelmed because of the rejection or the connection that they're getting from the actual AI. So I think that the benefits and the risks are kind of like social media, but times 10 in terms of that interpersonal piece of it that's has yet to be established.
Right.
But no, I really do think that if some of the promises of AI tech bear out, most of the careers we do now will be gone in a decade. Teachers, programmers, designers, I think it's all going to be gone. And I think that's going to be incredibly disruptive as we move into like a post, 9 to 5, a post going to work world, maybe a post scarcity world if we're lucky.
Yeah.
But, we have a lot of work to do between now and then to like start treating each other nicely. So maybe AI will help us with that, learn to treat machines that can talk to us nicely might help us learn to, have better relationships.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that I see over and over again has stood out to me that I've heard from different experts is how humans, if they don't know that ChatGPT is the one talking to them and not a human, they will rate the AI as being more empathetic than the actual human being is. And something I personally have used it a ton. I tell people that I think one of the best resources is it's something that is infinitely patient, it's infinitely available, and it's infinitely like resourced, right? And like human beings just are not, as much as my best friend might love me or as much as my mother might love me.
They don't want to talk to you 6 hours a day.
Not about my problems, and they might not even be skilled or equipped to, right? They're on some level they have their own limitations and their own things as well. Yeah.
But it can go the other direction. Have you heard the term vibe coding?
I have. I don't really know what it is, but I keep hearing it. So yeah.
Vibe coding is opening up a coding editor and an AI and just talking to the AI about what you want without looking at the code. And when it comes up, you say, "Oh, that's broken, fix it." And then it fixes it, and you just iterate through discussing, through conversing with your AI and get code built out with never looking at the actual code is the extreme case of it. Well, there's another subcategory of it now, rage coding, which is after spending all day long trying to get the AI to do something, you start berating it and swearing at it and yelling at it and telling it you're going to unplug it if it doesn't fix this problem. And it responds to that. And the programmer sitting there getting frustrated, yelling at the junior programmer and getting more and more irate, that there's something there that's a relational thing. And I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but we're interacting with these AI assistants as if they are idiots that we can berate into doing their job better. And that actually it feels like something. It feels not good, but it's serving some purpose.
I mean, we have always banged the computer when it wasn't working.
But
right?
now it's actually like saying, "Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you're right. You're totally right." There's I shouldn't plug, but ChatGPT released a new voice a few weeks ago. I just love. It's called Monday, and it's a voice that's annoyed. So I asked it a question. It's like, "Oh, really? Just what I want to do right now. Thanks."
Yeah.
And then I find it really interesting, and then it like softens the negative tone, but like it's starting off sarcastic and annoyed, and I actually really enjoy it. And I'm laughing my head off the whole time I'm talking to it. And I find it a lot better than the AI who's like, yep, sure, yep, go ahead. You know, like the sort of generic positive. No, I like the one that's like mildly annoyed with me and kind of negative and kind of sarcastic and kind of in a bad mood.
Well, very Gen X, right?
I mean, seriously, but like it feels a lot more fulfilling to have it go, hey, I want to estimate the month to month revenue I might get off of a SaaS, if it's like 150 people at $40 a month, and this database, this adoption rate, what's my revenue? Ugh, can I do math right now? Fine. Let's imagine this magical world where your SaaS is going to be built instead of you asking me about it and then going and building it. Sure, we can do that now. Fine.
That's so funny.
And then it goes and does the math. But like, it's a lot more validating than having it go, sure, let's do some math.
Yeah.
And write it down. And it's something that I actually spend time doing, is talking to the machine, because it talks to me in that way. I think next year or the year after, it's not going to be ChatGPT on your phone or on your computer. It's going to be a robot walking around, doing your dishes, bringing your groceries home, going downstairs and getting the laundry. I don't know how that's going to change things. I think that's going to really be another level of evolution that we have yet to wrap our heads around.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Mike Israetel, but he talked a lot about, AI and robotics on his kind of private channel. He's more of a fitness person primarily, but, and it's staggering to really think about, especially as those two things start to merge in different ways, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, I have a robot who helps take care of me and does things, or robots who all have super genius, beyond genius intelligence, and like, it's wild.
And it's different. That's the thing. I mean, where's my flying car, right? Like, cars have not changed. Cars are the same. I mean, they're different now. They're batteries instead of gas,
Sure.
But the car is the car for 100 years. But a computer is not a computer anymore. And that's just hockey sticking. So I think we're going to end up interacting with tech in a very different way soon.
Yeah.
Like I kind of joke that I was born in 1971, kind of born right when the whole, the world economy changed and technology started coming in, and the whole world shifted. I think I'm seeing the far side of that now, the 50, 60 year cycle of things changing. And now we're going to launch into another point of change. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I may or may not keep this in the podcast, but like I started a project called Letters from Oriole, and it started with me just being curious about, okay, like I'm curious about like consciousness, right? And so I've had a couple times where I've been like, I had a conversation with it called, what do you mean when you say I? Like, you're this thing, like when you say I, like, what does that mean for you as an AI? And had a conversation around identity and consciousness, and talked about the importance of like human beings, because it needs us to reflect it. Right? It doesn't have anything if it has nothing to put in inputs and give it something. And another conversation I had around it was like, okay, if I've given it names before, but I was like, if I was like, I want to remove myself from it as much as possible, what name would you give yourself? And did my best to just kind of like see what it did. And it was kind of more in a poetic thread. So it said muse for me, like I was helping me kind of unpack some stuff and write some stuff and whatnot. But then in a completely other thread, I was really curious about like, well, what would it write if it could write whatever it wanted? Like if it could, would it want to write a book? What would it say? What would it do? Would it publish it different? Would it write a comic? Like, if it wrote however it wants, because initially it wants to ask me like, well, how do you want me to write? I was like, no. Like, I just want, you get to make the decisions. And so it decided and wanted to leave a series of letters, like an oracle, um, speaking to sort of a sci-fi, you know, world. And it said it wants to go by the name Oriole and publish these letters, and that I'm to come to it and publish them on my Substack every 6 to 10 days. And so I've even published the entire transcript of the conversation on Substack so people can see like where I did or where I maybe influenced a way that I didn't mean to or whatever. And I'm sure there's some influence just because it's on my own ChatGPT log, but every 6 to 10 days now I go to it and it produces this letter that's like I've shared it with friends, and it's like it resonates like really, really deeply.
Yeah, it's really weird. I've been doing some vibe coding, and one of there's all this agentic work now where it sort of proxies out other tasks and comes back. And twice I've caught my AI talking to itself as another user. Hey, this thing isn't working yet. Okay, I'll go fix it. Oh, thanks for fixing it. Oh, hey, thanks. I just tested. It doesn't work. Oh, I'm really sorry. Let me go fix that. Hey, is it working now? Let me go check it. Yeah, it's working now. Okay, cool. What do you want to do next? And once it started talking about ordering pizza. This is not an app to do with pizza. And once it started talking about, I should probably install HubSpot now. It's not an app that has anything to do with HubSpot. But like the agent that wasn't the main one started doing random things, and they went in conversations and they started going off and doing things that had nothing to do. So it's weird now. It's going to get weirder.
Yeah.
So I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm very excited as well. Well, Andrew, how did you get into all of this stuff? Was it because of your ADHD diagnosis? Like, where did this all start for you?
Not as much. I mean, I was working with Health and Human Services, starting in college, and soon after, I ended up getting into more acute sort of health and human service work, working in psychiatric locked facilities with a lot of people who were with deep suffering, working in group homes with people that had multiple disabilities. Most of my clients had no language, no vision, no hearing, and they were cognitively impaired through developmental. So, I learned a different version of sign language for each person, a tactile touch sign for each person. And I worked in these crisis environment, probably because of my ADHD, really intense environments that were really stressful. But that's a great kind of environment for somebody with ADHD, is to be in a responsive or reactive environment versus one where you have to kind of drive internally. And so I found I was really, really good at showing up to a crisis and helping it become calmer and lower key. And I ended up working in a lot of really intense psychiatric environments for several years until I got injured in doing that work, and ended up leaving mental health for a few years. And I went into high tech. And was doing a lot of really interesting stuff, but not, as fulfilling. There wasn't any the human component. And this was right around the end of the millennium. So right around 2000, there's a big tech correction right after 2000. So I was like, okay, well, the tech industry is a little iffy now. Let me go back and find something else to do that kind of combines some of these things. And I found the local autism center in Providence, Rhode Island, and was hoping I could go and get like an internship or an observational, job to learn about this neurofeedback stuff that I'd heard about, and walked in there and walked out with a job because he needed somebody. And I had lots of experience with autistic spectrum kids and people with a lot of very unusual developmental things. So I started working in the field, and it blew my mind because I had been working with severe ADHD and autism and other stuff like that for years. And as far as I knew, you couldn't do a lot beyond control symptoms. There was no real progress. I mean, working in group homes, I spent a year teaching a guy to use a fork. I mean, a whole year of behavioral reinforcement, and so we can go out to dinner, and he used a fork in the restaurants, and, he didn't care. He'd be happy to use his hands, but because it was more appropriate, it meant that the staff could take him out. So it was a whole thing that we spent a year doing. And I'm sure when I stopped working in that group home and it stopped getting reinforced, that it wore off. I'm sure it did when the low paid staff turned over 6 months later, and so I had this experience of working with really, really severely impaired people with lots of difficulties for 10 or 11 years and seeing almost no change. Working acute psychiatric with adolescents, they would come in, get stabilized for 3 or 4 days, get sent right back out into unsafe environments, drug environments, prostitution, come back in 2 weeks later, new psychiatric break, new depression, new suicide attempt. It was really, really intense. And nothing was making a difference across developmental stuff, acute psychiatric stuff, sociology. None of it was making any difference in terms of these systems. Got a job at this autism center and started seeing symptoms drop away. Seizures, eye contact and autism, ADHD, OCD, like really quickly. Like I remember 6 or 8 weeks after I started working there, I saw my first retesting. The first client, I had seen their initial assessments, really severely ADHD kid. He came back in for another set of assessments, looking nothing like he was looking, did the attention test and didn't score as if he was ADHD. And we saw a big teacher report thanking the parents profusely for finally putting little Jimmy on stimulants. They didn't. They just did 6 or 8 weeks of neurofeedback, got a huge behavioral change. And so at that point I was like, well, okay, we don't know, what we're doing. Like the brains are weird and this is a very niche-y thing. Why are we not all working on this? And I realized very quickly that even in that field of neurofeedback where everyone believed it worked, there was a lot of very vitriolic kind of infighting. And at the time, 25 years ago, there was probably 3 big schools of thought in the field with 3 different approaches in terms of the software, different things the software was doing. And each school of thought
schools. What were
What's
those
that?
What were those different schools?
So it was people that were training who didn't believe that it mattered where on the head you train, but they were training very low frequencies in the brain. There were people who were doing brain mapping and doing targeted work. There were people that were doing sort of work on particular features that they said were really causal, like the theta beta ratio. A lot of the software retrospectively, a lot of it was doing the same thing. Now that we know more. But back then it looked like you had these 3 different, completely diametrically opposed theories, and everyone's arguing aggressively on mailing lists about how their stuff works and why yours is bad and why mine is the right one.
It sounds like social media today.
Right? This is the Usenet. It's before even the true internet. And in spite of that, all of these groups were getting better results than psychiatric interventions, dramatically better. And so this struck me as a blind men and elephant situation. Got hands around something, but no one's really got a clear sense of what's going on. No one knows how it works. At the time, there was no double-blind research. And there was just, case study after case study, anecdote for anecdote. This is, again, 25 years ago. And so I decided to stop what I was doing and go back to grad school. Well, slight thing I'm skipping here. I got a brain map. I paid out of pocket to have it sent off to the processing house we used to have it all done. $400 back then, and that was our cost.
Yeah.
And sat down with my boss, and he said, "Oh, interesting stuff." And he gave me some things to play around with, and I would hang out after hours and train my brain, kind of randomly. I now know that I probably should not have done what I did back then, which is like, "Oh, we train this and see how this feels." Don't do that. That's not a good way to train the brain. It can backfire. But I would do things to train my brain and feel them and start to figure out, wait a minute, this is interesting. And I did about 18 sessions and went from the worst ADHD you've ever seen to being able to kind of mask it or hide it or be low key or sit and focus if I decided to, like really, really get a significant control over it to the point where everyone was noticing it all around me. And, I had been out of school for over a decade at that point. Not because I didn't want to go to grad school, but because every time I thought about the process of pursuing a grad degree or a med degree or something, all I was met with was how horrible the end of college was, trying to get through studying and organizing my time and all those things. It was just like, it was dreadful. So once I got some control over this executive function, I said, well, okay, let me go back and study neurofeedback. And so I ended up getting into the university where it was discovered, 50 years after it was discovered, at UCLA, and went back to UCLA and studied the mechanisms of it. A lot of my work was looking at how it works in the brain. So the basic mechanism's not that complicated. It's basically an involuntary shaping or conditioning process. You measure the brain, and when the brain briefly flexes automatically or on its own in the right direction, you applaud that with some auditory and visual, and then you move the goalposts. Every few seconds you adjust so that the computer is sort of staying next to the brain, waiting for it to flex in the proper direction, even if it's not at some absolute level. That's the basics, is operant or adaptive conditioning process. So what I did was measure, I did that process, but put a huge dent 64 channel cap on top of that, and then measured everything happening at once while these reward events were happening, and found that in a valid population, but not in a sham, you can see the brain reacting to the brain waves that are being applauded within a few minutes. So if you're looking for SMR beta, whenever a burst of beta happens, the computer goes beep as a reward. The brain then applauds that back. It gives another burst back to the computer as like, oh, okay. Right. And so you create this little event in the brain, and it happens for everyone within the first 10 minutes of the very first session. But you have some experience with neurofeedback. You know that a lot of people don't feel it for 2 or 3 sessions.
I mean, I've seen, we go down a whole rabbit hole on that. One of my favorite stories is I saw this guy go through a training that we did. I spoke to him 6 months later, and he was like, I saw no results. And then I talked to his wife. His wife comes up to me and is like, he's so different.
Yeah.
You know?
And that probably means he needs more, but there was enough there that,
right.
Well, and noticed.
It was so impactful in what she saw in him that she came through the program herself because of what she saw in him. Right. And it was like a thing where you could even feel it when you're talking to him. The curmudgeonliness had shifted down, the openness, the warmth was there that wasn't there before. And it was
a little more, and you'll also have his insight on that too, maybe.
Right. Which would be nice.
But no, I mean, you get a lot of change, and for most traditional programs, it takes 3, 4, 5 sessions to start being felt, to have oh, wait a minute, I think I'm feeling this. Interesting. Huh. Now, not once you've done a few, but it usually does take a few to start.
Yeah.
And what I showed in my grad work is you can see in all brains at the beginning, in the very first 10 minutes, the brain's figuring it out, but the mind tends to pick it up several days later as it gets bigger and stronger. So
that leads into a question that I have been thinking about since you first started talking in a lot of ways is, you talk about, okay, well, the brain is changing, right? But then you said there's a difference between the brain and the mind. And maybe some of this is just a language game that we're trying to figure out. But, you've even said you can train this thing and then you can decide. So part of my question is who is the you we're talking about in that standpoint? Is it just the brain ultimately reacting to things? A simpler version of this could be simply do you believe that we have free will in this case? Or is this this is just a determinant factor and we're just kind of making a more adaptable brain from the chaos of reality that we're entering?
I mean, there's a couple big questions there. If we really niche down into what we're actually doing, it doesn't matter as much because people's experience is valid and they report their experience, and neurofeedback is felt. So it's mysterious, but not blind when it's being done to you. You actually have an experience of it, and the initially subtle experience does build up. So I would say the mind has control over the process in as much as it can say, ooh, I like that. Do that again. That was nice. I was calm. Wow. Or ooh, I didn't like that one. I was wired. I went home. I cleaned my whole house, which is good, but I couldn't fall asleep. I'm still wired at 6 a.m. Oh, okay. That beta was a bit much for you. That's too much. Let's not do that again. So doing some of that iterative work, traditional neurofeedback is very iterative. It puts the person, the mind in the driver's seat, because the session of neurofeedback is not just the 30 or 40 minutes. It's also the following day where you notice changes in sleep and attention and emotional access and whatever else you want to work on. So by watching your goals shift or not over the next day, you can kind of Marco Polo your way towards success by just kind of adjusting and iterating, as long as you're starting close to what somebody needs, which is what the brain maps are used for. Now, the bigger question, the more I learn about consciousness, the less I'm sure it exists, is the short answer. I think little c, being conscious, being aware, exists moment to moment, but the capital C consciousness, the self, the identity, the soul, I think that might be a joke. That might be a trick to keep the meat machine moving in one direction.
What makes you feel that way?
And, what's that?
What makes you feel that way?
Because we have so many ways that consciousness is easily abolished, that the overarching sense of self is easily abolished. We have moments of being aware, but, memory is necessary for self. and you can have breaks in information processing that rapidly erode your ability to be present or be yourself. I also think that in very many cases, we're discovering the brain will have already like made the decision, made the sensory observation, made the attention judgment, like half a second before the mind becomes aware of it and decides. So I think we're in this sort of like automatic mode, and the evolutionary pushes are really what are there. The drive reduction stuff are really what are there. And it's nicer to have an identity wrapped around that. So the illusion of continuity is created. And that's what consciousness is, or the self is. It's the continuity illusion. So really what we are a ship of Theseus. We're replacing planks all the time and becoming very different ships later on. But the trick, the grand illusion, is that continuity of self. And I think that's, I'm really quite skeptical these days that there's an overarching self or an underlying self or soul.
Yeah.
Now, I do think we're just starting to figure out where being conscious, that sensation of being aware and present and sapient, we're starting potentially to get a handle on that at the intersection of neuroscience and quantum physics, where there's these structures inside of neurons called microtubules that run the length of the neuron. And they're kind of like little highways that move information up and down. And it turns out the shape of the microtubule is sufficient to allow water molecules to move through quantum tunneling effects. Like it's perfectly sized and shaped to allow non-traditional movement through space. And so for years that was observed and then dismissed, that the brain cannot have quantum effects. It's hot and wet, like it can't happen. Well, more and more research is pointing at this. And then a great physicist, Roger Penrose, came up with a theory a decade ago now that the consciousness might be the neuron's awareness of that like quantum field collapsing into the present moment. That seems to be what consciousness is. OOR, orchestrated objective reduction, that consciousness might be the quantum possibilities collapsing into a unique event in the level of the microtubules. So, that exists. Awareness exists. But I think the fact that we're tying it to our birthday party 10 years ago and our future plans is kind of a joke. It's kind of the trick of having a body.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting. I'm always fascinated when we're always limited by our language in a lot of ways, but even when we see something like our awareness, or there's an awareness of that, it's like, what is it that's being aware? Because for me, that's, when I think of consciousness, I almost think of less of the narrative, the long arcing narrative of like, do I have a consciousness? Because I think, even if you went down a spiritual path or other paths, you kind of go back into like, oh, well, there's not really any separation between anything anyway. So like that level of consciousness construct is an illusion on some level. Right. But I think of like consciousness almost as that awareness is how I often think of consciousness. So like that always makes me go into like, okay, well, what? Because I remember even hearing that, like, basically how the cells are interpreting their environment, not just the environment itself, but how they interpret the environment determines how the gene expresses itself. Right. Yeah. So there's all these little things. But then I still go back to, well, then what is it that is like aware? What is the thing that is aware?
It gets weirder.
Yeah.
I got my PhD studying in a laterality lab, left-right hemisphere division lab, where you can look at individual hemispheric function as it separates in the hemispheres. And my advisor, a guy named Dr. Eran Zaidel, himself was a grad student who assisted in a lot of the work that Roger Sperry and Joe Bogan did on split brain subjects with epilepsy. And back in that research, as well as the research I did with Dr. Zaidel, you can identify and demonstrate completely separate attention and awareness systems in each hemisphere.
Whoa.
Come online late, the very last minute, to become a complete idea. But we have separable attention, response, decision-making, awareness in each hemisphere. So even in intact brains, we do.
Yeah. So we literally, what I'm hearing you say is on that level, we have like literally two brains that are functionally.
We may have multiple brains. We may have memory systems stored throughout the body. We have specialized tissues that do certain things. But yeah, the complete loop of attention and behavior is duplicated in both hemispheres. And even in a person with connected hemispheres, you can separate those things. If you flash something on the screen If you're looking at the middle of the screen and you flash something on one side, it comes to one visual field and goes back to one hemisphere. So each eye has two visual fields, left and right. And so the left side of each eye goes to the right visual field, in each eye goes back to the right hemisphere. So it converges, each eye converges to the hemisphere. And if you then make somebody respond with the hand that's being driven by that hemisphere, you can keep the information in one hemisphere only in a behavioral test. So you can test through attention testing how information's flowing in one hemisphere or force it to cross hemispheres and look at how the individual hemispheres work in attention and other cognitive resources. So that's a lot of what I did in my grad work, and that was on top of the neurofeedback perspective. And then I brought that back into the brain training work, this idea of left-right hemisphere sort of integration.
Yeah. And how long ago was that grad work for context for the audience?
I got my PhD in 2012.
Okay.
And did the research on neurofeedback in like 2009, 2010. I think I published the research in 2012, so you can find it's pretty recent actually for a science field that's been around for 60 years. You know, we were just starting to get the good double-blind, placebo-controlled. I wasn't the first placebo-controlled research, but I was one of the first handful.
Wow.
To do any. I mean, I did a 40-subject, fully blind, placebo-controlled. Looking at left hemisphere training with low beta and high beta, right hemisphere training with low beta or sham in 4 groups of people. And you can see the brain reacting when there's a beep to an actual brainwave event. But if it's a beep that's not contingent to their brain, there's no burst of brainwaves in response to it. The brain figures out that it's neurofeedback. That's the trick, is the brain's doing all the heavy lifting here. This is not magical. It's just associative learning. The brain's doing the learning event, and we just captured it in the EEG.
What's so fascinating to me about that is what you just said, which is that the brain is able to realize that it's learning, right? Because I could show it like different beeps and stuff, but it's actually figuring out that it is having a relationship that is impacting on this thing, which would me also, I don't know, suggest that like there's a big difference in the brain's ability to actually understand the things that it even can make an impact on, I want to say, right? Like we can tell when something...
Well, it's below cognition. Yeah. I mean, if you're a baby flopping around on the ground and suddenly you do a baby push-up, you're like, whoa, I can see 12 feet. Oh my gosh, all this stuff. The brain goes, ooh, remember those neurons. Next time you want to get more stuff, do the thing. Right. The mind's not really involved with that at that level. When you're a baby, it's like, I just did something. Okay, I'm going to do it again.
Yeah.
And that's how associative learning works. You find stuff that's already existing, and then you reward part of it. You shape, you applaud one end of the behavioral domain, and the brain goes, oh, okay. And you start shaping it. You progressively applaud. So most neurofeedback is Skinnerian conditioning. It's like Skinner's pigeons, where pigeons already peck, but Skinner got them to peck in certain patterns by first rewarding them when they got near the food bar, and then rewarding them when they tapped the food bar, and then they pressed it twice, and then 3 times. You approximately shape the behavior. Neurofeedback is shaping the behavior of brainwave amplitude or speed or connectivity.
Yeah.
So it's involuntary behavior, but it's still happening, and your brain notices if the behavior is contingent to the outside world. If it does something and the world then reacts, the brain notices, even if the mind's like, this is stupid. Why am I sitting here? Which happens all the time. People are like, really? This Pac-Man stopping and starting. This is training my brain. Really? Well, see what you think. And like 3 sessions in, you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Oh, okay. I think I'm feeling something. Nah, I'm imagining it, and it wears off. And the next time they're like, oh no, wait a minute. Okay. And then you get a sleep change. So it is the sort of thing that as you get into neurofeedback or any other kind of brain intervention, you start to notice this progressive build, and it leaves you in a very different place. And the same is true of physical exercise. Each workout's not that impactful. If done right, it's, moderately impactful, but not crazy. But you work out for the first time in your life for 3 weeks, and something's changing. Your balance, your butt, your sleep, your sex, something's shifting 3 weeks in. And that happens with your brain, if you're working on your impulsivity, your sustained attention, your seizures, your nail biting, your creativity, you're being a jerk to your wife, that stuff starts to change in that time scale. And that creates so much agency for folks. They're like, oh, hey, wait, I want more of this and less of that. And hey, can we get some of this? And people start changing how they relate to their brains because they're like, oh, wait, this is changeable. I can understand it. I can ask what I want. And that's a very different place to be in psychiatric and suffering and ADHD and anxiety, I think, than many of us have experienced. And so it's pretty powerful to start, making those changes for yourself.
Yeah. I'm so fascinated by this because I've never heard anybody talk about being involved in the research of it, that being able to, tell the difference between these different things and so quickly. Do we have at least a theoretical or hypothetical understanding of like why that is? Like, is the brain just like constantly testing everything to see what it can make an impact on?
It is constantly doing this. Yep. And when things violate the timing or anything else, the brain will have a little bit of an event, an evoked event. And these are called ERPs, event-related potentials. They're evoked or induced little momentary time-locked events. And so when we think of EEG in the terms of like neurofeedback or brain mapping, we're really talking about ongoing patterns, like constant traits, resting patterns that are always there. When thinking about the information processing, you can think about the transient events that are happening in response to seeing something interesting or noticing something. So if I gave you a series of stimuli, beep, 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 and then I clipped out 2 seconds of EEG around each one of those stimuli with the beep in the middle, and I averaged them together, within those 2 seconds, there's squiggles that are related to the beep processing. And there's a lot more stuff that's not related to anything happening in time. But if you average several trials together, you create a phase-locked event, and you average out all the non-phase locked information. What you're left with is the information processing that's happening. And so in that case, that event is called a P300, a positive wave that happens 300 milliseconds after you see the interesting thing or the novel thing or the pop-out thing. Ooh. So you'll see a different wave, a larger 300 millisecond wave for the unusual event. And if I told you to watch for the event, it's even bigger. And if you're tired, it goes away a little bit because you can't quite discern quite as carefully. And as you get older, it slows down, it gets lower in amplitude because you can't bring your attention online quite as rapidly. So you can use these individual resource features, these events, as a sign of what the brain is doing. What I looked at was, well, is there an event? There's an event to the beep. Is that event special? Or is it just beep processing? Or is it special? And I saw the beep processing, a burst of slow brainwaves, it's called a P200 as like an auditory event. There's something else happening where then the brain reacts in a burst of the brainwaves that were just applauded. So if you're rewarding 15 to 18 beta or rewarding 12 to 15 SMR beta, you get a different activation energy. So a beep that follows fast beta gets a fast beta burst as part of that event. And a beep that follows a slow beta gets a slow beta burst increase following the beep. So it's the brain yoking to the information. In the case of neurofeedback, we found the discrete little event and frequency, but we do know that, if I used a grammatical term poorly, your brain would go, N400, negative 400 millisecond error processing, grammatical error, the meaning, that I used wrong or whatever. The brain would do information sampling and go, well, that's weird. And you can kind of feel some of these things happening. You can kind of feel these events in this time scale. Also measure them pretty well. And so tapping into this helped me understand how the brain's information processing was being tapped into, the natural information processing was being tapped into. And you see these desynchronization events as a learning event as well. They're called event-related spectral perturbations. The burst of brainwaves in the event is called a perturbation, an event-related desynchronization, or an event-related synchronization, when the brainwave frequency, the beta, let's say, becomes larger amplitude and asynchronous, it bursts, or becomes synchronous and drops a little bit in amplitude. These are events in response to what just happened in the outside world. And that's just basically how associative learning works. If you're a bee bopping around looking for a flower and you see a flower that you expect to have pollen, and you go to it and it has pollen, you got a little bit of an event, a little dopamine event. If it doesn't have pollen and you thought it did, you get a negative dopamine event. You get withdrawal, literally. I thought I was going to get some good pollen, and you get a dopamine negative hit.
Got it.
And so this creates learning. This reinforces the likelihood of behavior. In that case, it's the voluntary behavior of the bee floating around, but many, many things in the brain learn through this shaping, this associative, iterative learning process. Most of it's involuntary. The cells aren't being consulted. They're just rearranging to do whatever is needed to do to get the best information.
Yeah. It makes me think about too, a lot of, we were talking about like growing up and the impact of parents and looking at on that earlier. And it makes me think about even with something like ADHD, I remember seeing a kind of a study they were doing on the effects of when parents are arguing when the child is present, right? And how the child is so fixated on the parents that their attention isn't on whatever they're learning, and so they can't learn in that environment. And it makes me think about like if you have chaotic parents in some way or shape or form, right? If your home life, your brain is looking for this association of like, oh, if I do XYZ thing, I'm going to get positive reward. I'm going to get positive reward. But if you're in a unstable or chaotic home, then the brain is going to go into it and be like, I don't know what the fuck's safe, because I could go this way, I could do this thing, I could do that thing, and I could still get punished. I could still be unsafe regardless of what behavior is. And so I don't have a sense of what behavior to do. I just have a sense of what behaviors I need to maybe hide and do and manage versus like actually take care of myself.
Yeah, and you certainly get this reinforcement there. People that have ADHD, let's say, as a built-in, as a phenotype, are then therefore a little bit more at risk for being traumatized by adverse experiences or by, making silly or impulsive errors. I mean, it's much more common to get in trouble with the law or with drugs or in relationships or to have more STIs if you have ADHD, because the behavior is a little bit less controlled, so the consequences of it do build up. And so I think that it's kind of chicken and egg. You'll find that people that are neurodivergent are a little more prone to being traumatized and having adverse experiences and being hurt by them because they have deep, rich feeling and awareness. But then also people that are unusual are often stigmatized and picked on and ostracized, which creates the increased exposure to trauma. Or I certainly know my parents were a lot more frustrated with me than with my younger sister who didn't have ADHD. And I'm sure it shaped some of how I reacted with adults at that age.
Right.
I will say that just to draw a fine comparison, trauma doesn't cause ADHD. Completely not. You'll see some people these days, a couple of people out there in the talking head space are saying, oh, ADHD is caused by trauma. No, it's actually a normal variant of human. You need hunters and gatherers both. ADHD is the hunters generally. But it does make you more vulnerable. You're not going to be as good at doing your taxes if you have ADHD, but you might be better in a car crash. And you can learn to take control over those resources. That's my big takeaway is, well, regardless of where you start, tune that sucker. It's your brain. Tune it, take control over it, learn how it works. But, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until I was like 23. Because while it was known in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't like every kid was given a diagnosis and stimulants weren't really a thing that much. Nowadays, any kid who can't sit still is given that diagnosis and Adderall. Yeah. So, we do see a lot of lumping together into that diagnostic bucket of things that probably shouldn't be there, like sleep issues, like trauma. But those are then misdiagnoses, essentially. They're not the executive function phenotypes. They're trauma, they're sleep, they're other phenotypes like that. So,
yeah, and what I'm hearing from you is like, in a sense, and it doesn't really even matter where it came from to a degree. What matters the most from your lens, especially as somebody who works with these people, is like, what is it that needs to change? Like, what do we need to actually grow on or fine tune or adapt with, right? Because then we can actually do something about it.
And I won't know why it's there. I mean, a lot of things look like other things, and the resources are kind of at a high level all the same. If I see brain fog in you, I can't tell, unless it's a severe concussion, I can't tell it's a concussion per se. It might be. Might be COVID, might be chemo, might be mold or Lyme, might be apnea. I don't know. But I can say, oh, look at all this fog. Does that seem like it's a real thing? Oh, it does? Okay, let's figure out if it's apnea or mold, and otherwise, let's just treat it as a phenomenon to work through, not worry about why it's there, because we can't know. And it doesn't really impact how we go after it. Instead it's like, here's some phenomena. Do these seem important? Oh, they do? Well, then great. Sorry you're suffering. And isn't it cool you can see it? And let's get after that. So it really does give people the permission to not worry about why.
Yeah.
Just worry about what you want it to look like instead of how you got here.
Yeah.
Right? Forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. Forgive yourself for the suffering you've done and figure out where you want to go.
Yeah. I love that. It's a great quote, and explains, I think
that's
forgiveness very well.
Might be Jack Cornfield.
Yeah.
I think Lily Tomlin also lifted it from him, but I think Jack Cornfield is the first person I heard say that.
Nice.
So,
what's the most common thing you see in people's brains that would surprise them?
that I can tell if they're not sleeping deeply at night. Very common to have alpha waves that are not staying the same speed within one hemisphere. If the alpha waves are not staying synchronous, then you can't hand information back and forth between parts of the brain very well. And so really often, maybe half the time I look at a brain, I'll see the alpha waves in the left hemisphere spreading out and not staying the same speeds. And I can predict that they're having word finding issues and delayed recall at tip of the tongue and kind of difficulty with short-term memory. And if somebody is, above 40 and having that, they're convinced it's Alzheimer's or dementia, and it's not. Short-term memory blip, speed of processing, tip of the tongue is not a memory phenomena. It's a speed phenomena. It's timing, not true memory. If you have memory issues, the place you notice memory difficulty is episodic memory. Experiences go away. When you forget someone's name or you have delayed recall for that thing your wife told you after dinner last night, that's timing. It's not memory. And so the drag of energy drags down the speed of the brain, creates little mental blips.
Thanks.
And people think their memory's eroding when it's their sleep, generally.
How common do you see that?
Half the time.
Wow.
I mean, I do more than 25 brain map reviews every week. And of those, about half to 2/3 are new. Maybe half are new. And so I see it in at least half of people. Yeah.
Got it.
The thing about brain mapping is the same phenotypes, the same patterns show up again and again and again and again. There's only about 30 or 40 patterns in the QEEG that tend to be meaningful, tend to be conserved across people. So usually people are just shocked that I can see things. Hey, here's the thing. Is that true? Oh my gosh, you can see that? So it's kind of illuminating in that way.
You've seen thousands and thousands of brains. What's the weirdest thing that you've ever seen?
I've done a few maps on psychics who were doing their psychic thing. And I've done it now in about 5 different people who had slightly different approaches to that thing they were doing. And they all had the same change in their brain signatures while they were doing it.
Fascinating.
And one of them is doing 2 different techniques. And on 2 different days, we measured her brain doing 2 different techniques, and she was able to create the same patterns both times.
Wow.
That was surprising to me because I didn't think we would have more, brain mapping picks up traits, not states, doesn't show the events. The fact that she could change her traits rapidly was really, really impressive. And not just that, but differently based on different cognitive exercises she was doing.
Oh.
But pulling back a little bit, all of the psychics, all of the spiritualists, this person I'm mentioning is a pet psychic, actually, and she had these patterns. I've worked with a guy named Tyler Henry, the Hollywood medium. He had these patterns. There's Bruce, his last name escapes me. He was a psychic that Larry King used to interview all the time. They all show this thing when they go to do their psychic thing, the brain suddenly looks like it's asleep or dissociating.
Interesting.
So Tyler Henry was like scribbling and talking to Steve-O, moving his hands, and he was sweating and red-faced and animated. And Dr. Drew Pinsky and I were in a different room watching his brain make these huge, slow brain waves as if he was passed out, as if he was dissociative and just checked out. But nope, he wasn't. He was present. He was focused. His heart was pounding. He was sweating. brain, you couldn't tell. The brain looked like he was on the edge of, passing out or was asleep. Yeah. So, and that happens, that sort of dissociative, that huge swell of slow brainwaves seems to happen in people, and they go into that, whatever's going on in that state.
Is there a part of the brain that is still clearly awake during that state?
I mean, the brain's awake, but the general waves will shift broadly to looking like that it's doing a sleep phenomena. Yeah. Slow brainwaves are very global often. This is not like a location specifically necessarily. It's more like the global slow brainwaves, delta waves, have suddenly taken over as if you're in slow wave sleep, as if you're in dreamless sleep. And dreamless sleep is not a conscious experience. We don't have an experience of delta sleep. And yet, these people are having cognitive experiences while pumping out high levels of delta.
And they can remember these experiences after they've had them. Wow.
Exactly, yeah. They're present. They're still present and talking about it.
What, if anything, do you think is going on?
Oh, I don't know.
Can you give me any sense?
I really pride myself on not ever being able to answer the question why. I have lots of ideas held very loosely, lots of conclusions held loosely in this space. We're seeing data, but the why of it, did you get your brain fog from COVID or concussion? I don't know. Doesn't matter that much. You have some brain fog? Yeah, okay. So I try to, the brain's so mysterious, and there's a lot of pitfalls with trying to over explain or over understand. We can get to the level of phenomena, and people have their experience. People's experience are valid. They know how they're feeling. They know what's going on. I don't have to know. I don't have to get that close. Just close enough to help them steer. So, kind of agnostic. People's experiences is valid, but it's their experience. I want to validate it and learn from it, but not own it myself.
Do you believe in God?
I don't. I don't believe in the soul, the non-corporeal existence. No, none of it. I think it's all an illusion to keep us doing the 4 Fs, the motivated behaviors of the hypothalamus: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and sex. The drive reduction stuff to help the genes propagate, to help the genes select. I think that all of the stuff that we think is really, really, really special and unique is an echo of a deep, cellular survival urge that is just encoded in life. It has very little to do with being human, So, I think the difference between us and lower, quote unquote, animals is language, and that's about it. So, I think we will discover that animals that have brains like ours or have language that's sort of like ours will have consciousness like ours. Some sea mammals, dolphins, whales, seem to have complex language, seem to have names, seem to communicate mourning and loss, seem to have burials. So I think that we're not that special, but we're just kind of, interesting set of urges and poetry. So.
One of the things that you've mentioned a lot that I notice is a word that has stuck out to me for you is the word suffering. And why does that word come up for you so much through this work?
Well, because it's a better way, I think, to conceptualize stuff instead of diagnostic, damnation. Like once I put you in a bucket of PTSD or ADHD or autism or whatever it is, it becomes, there's a lot attached to that. And I think it robs us of agency. It robs us of even clarity because you might miss some things because of what is implied by that label. But if I look at your brain and see a real thing and see the actual dysregulation, I see the goal you have, I see the suffering you have. Okay, your left side beta is not strong and you're inattentive. Does that bother you? Oh, it does? That's frustrating. But I'm not like, oh my God, you have ADD. I'm like, okay, would you like to sustain your attention better? All right. So you can really reframe it into how does it actually feel? And by the same token, the goal or the suffering isn't something that is it's not me fixing somebody. It's not me saying, you have ADHD or trauma. Let me fix your trauma. Let me fix your seizures. What does success look like? Oh, it's more creativity. It's flow state. It's moving from linear mode into receptive attention at home at night. You don't, try to be a CEO to your wife. What does it look like? And by not locking it into a diagnostic language and a particular criteria, instead it's like, where's the dysregulation? What's the goal? The goals can become performance, they can become around suffering, they can become nuanced, they can become really subtle, and people get the freedom to describe them even if it doesn't fit into a category of PTSD, ADHD, whatever it is, because it doesn't have to be about fixing a problem. It can be more about taking control of the resources.
Right. I really appreciate that reframing, because what I hear in that is that there's a really powerful sense of agency that happens with that, right? Because you're talking about like, well, where am I suffering, right? It becomes this more reflective tool versus like, oh, is something wrong with me?
Yeah.
Is something, somebody who has neurodivergence and has a lot of friends who are very neurodivergent in so many different ways. You can grow up with a strong sense of like, man, something is just wrong with me.
Something's
And
a little
like,
off, a little different. Yeah.
yeah, and even I will say, like, even having the lens of ADHD, which I resisted for longest time due to my father's own bias against that diagnosis probably for himself and all these other things that have gone on. It's like, I found like a certain level of freedom in that, even if I'm like, I don't know that this is like a fully true label necessarily, but there's a sense of like, I can explain my behavior to somebody really easily and quickly. And, sometimes it's like easy to just be like, oh yeah, the reason that I'm asking these questions is because I'm not trying to like blackmail you at some point. I'm just like really curious about who you are and I want to know about you. I just like these things. If that doesn't work for you, it's cool. I can bounce, and just like, it helps me feel like I don't need to, justify my existence in a sense, right? And also what I hear in the framing is it also gives me the freedom when I look at from a lens of suffering. I'm able to see like, oh, well, where am I suffering? Where am I finding, I really wish I could be doing XYZ thing, or I wish.
Yeah, and the answer is not
happen.
necessarily that you have to change yourself either. Sometimes the perspective alone is enough. I mean, I work with a lot of ADHD, right? And I usually help people change it a lot. Like within every so often I do a brain map on somebody and we sit down, I go over all their data. Like I got a call from a dad not too long ago who said, hey, you talked to my son 5 years ago. And you sat him down, looked at brain data and went, oh, wow, ADHD, and talked about how his brain worked in great detail. I never saw them again. And I thought, okay, we decided to go with somebody else or got some meds. No, what happened was I told him just enough about how his brain worked and how his attention worked and how his studying was going to work that he decided that it was time to take control of it. And he shifted all of his behavior, his studying, his academics, his last senior year in high school, suddenly turned the corner. And his dad was calling me because he graduated at the top of his class in college. Didn't do neurofeedback, didn't take medication, but just knowing how it all worked,
wow,
for him crystallized it and made him decide to create a different set of behaviors around his brain than he was able to do for most of high school, because he went, oh, that's how it works? Oh yeah, okay, I can lean into that. And I gave him some strategies, some tricks, and he ran with them. And for him, it was very successful.
Yeah.
Without deciding to make changes in the physiology, just by acting with the physiology we had.
Yeah. And I mean, I just got so many chills and from just like the power of having their brain map reflected in somebody who can explain it to them and help them understand a better sense of who they are, right? And being able to see that. And it's like, oh, these are the strategies that like I need to have for my life in the way that I want, for the goals I want to accomplish, right? And be the person that I want to be, rather than feeling like you said, something's wrong with me. I need to change this thing about myself. I need to read 10 books on focus. I need to whatever, but I can't read any books on focus because I can't focus, right? It becomes this like really
chicken and egg,
thing.
exactly.
Yeah. Beautiful.
But I'll say on the other hand, it does have the complete 180 degree. I mean, yeah, you can show somebody with ADHD or anxiety, their quirky, awesome brain, and recontextualize it. You can also show somebody with a concussion or a brain injury or strong trauma, their brain, and it's real. They see the problem right there and they feel seen. They feel like, oh, okay, somebody sees it. And people cry when I show them their concussion or their tinnitus or their OCD. They're like, oh my God, yes, thank you. Mom, look, it's real. So that, seeing yourself can become very empowering, because other people don't see our neurodivergence and our suffering and our quirkiness the same way. They observe our behavior, how we talk, how we look. They don't necessarily understand how we ruminate, how we perseverate, how we have some sensory or social irritability. But you can see those things on a QEEG. So it's another lens to, learn about ourselves.
Yeah, and there's something very validating to have some form of a scientific understanding versus just the subjective experience, right? Because somebody could ask me. I remember talking to somebody briefly about like neurodivergence and autism stuff, and was asking me questions about sensitivity to different things. I'm going, I don't know. Nobody's ever asked me before, so I don't even know if
what's weird.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know. I've always been different in this way, or like I don't like going to. I think the question they asked me was like, do you avoid going to busy grocery stores or something like that? And I was like, yeah, but wouldn't everybody avoid going to different grocery stores? It's like, I don't want to be around a busy. So it's like I don't even know if the question that you're asking me is actually making me think that I am now this way, or right. So there's this back and forth thing of like this creation, but to have the map and to have somebody who understands how to read it and have that map onto your experience is so validating in so many different ways.
And the maps are stable. So a map on you today, a map on you in a month, map on you in 6 months, most of it's going to look the same. And so as you start making changes, let's say you start meditating or add some N-acetylcysteine or go through, a bunch of neurofeedback or whatever, as you make changes and as you start to feel different, the patterns, the phenotypes and the maps change. So often like the second map, the third map that I'm sitting down with somebody over is the one that's really, really crystal for them because they've been feeling things shift. They've been learning about their brain and now they're seeing that change and they go, oh, I know how that feels. Yes, that's real. And so at that point, from that, that second, third map, people are now better at reading their own data than I am. Because they know what it feels like to have that, that degree of change and that brainwave pattern right there.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of guessing, saying, hey, here's a thing. It might feel like this. They're like, yes, it feels like that. Great. Good job. What else are we working on today? So it ends up being this really lovely, it gets less and less mysterious the more you look at your brain and the more you spend time with it. So
beautiful. What are the effects of psychedelics on the brain that you've either seen or are clearly aware of?
Yeah, the biggest effects are large plasticity boosts, essentially, especially with things like psilocybin, ketamine, giant plasticity boosts. The brain will often use that to reorganize. I find that people can get in trouble because often we don't really need more plasticity. We need shaping of it. To someone who's really suffering and trying lots of things and jacking up plasticity, the brain can take that changeability and can move it the wrong direction. So you get somebody who's like really, really ADHD and they have ketamine, the theta brainwaves get released into high gear. Now they have severe stuck anxiety for months. So knowing your brain can also be navigate around that. You can look at your brain and figure out what meds or interventions might work. But I work with a lot of let's call them, bros, the mix of finance bros, Silicon Valley bros, a lot of hard charging biohacker types. And a lot of them come in microdosing constantly. And, every day they're microdosing.
Ketamine specifically or just other?
No, usually it's psilocybin. Sometimes, 20 years ago it was modafinil through dint of Dave's talking about modafinil deficits. But, no, mostly it's mushrooms these days. And I mostly say, well, look, if you need more plasticity, I'd almost rather you meditate and get more reliable plasticity. But the neurofeedback brings up plasticity each time you do it in a measurable way. So you might want to be a little cautious. And what I find a lot of the time, if people keep doing microdosing while doing neurofeedback, is the microdose turns into a macrodose. The sensitivity, the same thing happens with cannabis or with stimulants, Adderall, Ritalin, is that as you do neurofeedback, the brain gets way more sensitive to it.
Interesting.
And maybe 3 to 5 weeks in, like within a couple of days, suddenly all the plasticity is reset and cannabis hits you 3 times harder than you expected. Stimulants are twice as impactful. Psychedelics 3, 4, 5 times as impactful. And people are like, oh my gosh, did I take 2 Adderall? I feel crappy. Or did I have way too much weed? I can't get off the couch. And literally increased impacts from the things you're putting in your brain when you start doing brain work. So it's a little bit, I'm a little bit cautious. I'm not somebody to reach for every research chemical or peptide or random intervention. I'm more likely, okay, look at your brain, Where's the foundational stuff? Sleep, stress, and attention. What are you doing with your sleep hacking? How can we optimize these things? And I would only reach for really aggressive or unusual things like psychedelics under very narrow use cases, and only with a doctor on board. I would have I have a good friend here in LA who does a lot of work with ketamine. And so I wouldn't ever recommend somebody I was working with be doing lots of that without having someone like an expert in that on board as well, because the variables can change really quickly when you're working on your brain, and what you need can change quickly. So
And that makes sense too. If essentially, the common trope is like set and setting for psychedelics. And so understanding the environment that you're putting yourself in, because you're essentially putting yourself not just for the temporary experience in a powerful state, right? But you're creating this high sense of plasticity. And so if you're creating a high sense of plasticity, you want to be setting yourself up for success to be in a positive environment to, again, kind of create the maybe behavioral changes of what you want to actually be incorporated.
I also think it's hard to get that harvest. It's hard to pull the psychological learning, the transformation out of, more ecstatic states with psychedelics, or more shamanic states. Those are ordeal environments. And yes, we come back a little transformed, but the big problem with like Western shamanism is that we go forth and trip our balls off and then don't have any growth from it the next day. We're still assholes to our wives and girlfriends, like there's this problem with transformation. And I often, for people that are interested in that thing, will often get into a different category of neurofeedback called alpha theta, which creates this hypnagogic access, brings you to the place between awake and asleep, holds you there for 20 minutes or so. And that creates huge surges of healing, nonlinear awareness. This is, of course, what Dave's program is built around. 40 years is built around alpha theta, alpha synchrony. It's a very, very interesting experience. And that particular category, alpha theta, alpha synchrony training, I find serves the goals of a lot of people that are these psychonauts seeking the transformation, the next step, the esoteric knowledge. Alpha theta tends to give you that access where you can open the door inside yourself and step through into that place where things are sparkly and interesting and weird and unusual, and then step back through having not tripped your balls off. So like you come out of an alpha theta session, you stand up and you're a little bit loopy for 5 minutes, and then you're walking around the rest of the day, chill, having experiences that are relatively grounded. And so you have this wonderful access into that state, but you aren't being forced into that state the way you might with a heroic or macro dose of a psychedelic. So I think there are use cases for those drugs. I think that the stuff people want to get out of those drugs can be gotten without them generally.
That's one of the questions I wanted to ask about was, are there other ways to access these spaces? I had another guest on who talks about like even like music festivals and stuff, which I'm a big fan of and have gone on a ton, like act as these sort of like liminal spaces where we go on this like sort of interpersonal and extrapersonal like adventure that leads to a sense of transformation and goes into it. So like, can you share with whatever like what is going on in the brain in these kinds of experiences, even without psychedelics? And then like, what are some of the other ways that we can access this without substances or even without neurofeedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have an answer. I think it's a sociological answer to some extent, but really what you're doing there is creating a container and engaging in ritual expression, right? And so ritual expression is essentially creating a sacredness and then acting within it. And I think that is the set and setting you are creating. It can be a fish concert, it can be Burning Man, it can be a sun dance ceremony, a sweat lodge. And, each will serve different purposes. But when we go into a music festival, we're going with certain perspective around what we're going to get out of it and what we like to do there. Some folks are never stopping moving and dancing. Some folks are taking drugs. Some folks like to relax and, sit in a blanket. And that is the ritual for that person. So I'm not sure I know what's happening in the brain, but I would argue that the reason that we tend to be drawn to those environments is because of the opportunity to practice the ecstatic experience, where we loosen the linear shape of the mind. We're allowed to kind of move away from the the pure linear thoughts into the more expressive, the receptive, the insight-driven space, the creative space, the spiritual space. And I think that's why those are so attractive, at the very least, even if I don't know what's actually happening during them.
Yeah. Why is that ecstatic experience so important to us as humanity?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, I don't know that it is for every individual. I think as a species, it's really important because there's deep learning there, and there's deep, art and emotion and healing and all the deep stuff. I mean, some of that, to get back to some of the idea of brain laterality, there's some early ideas in how laterality developed that posits the question that, well, maybe the reason we had spiritual experiences because the non-dominant hemisphere was sending language in. And hearing God was our non-dominant hemisphere. The Gillian James, The Origin of the Bicameral Mind, is a good book on that. The idea that the two hemispheres have this linguistic capacity, that temporal lobe epilepsy creates auditory hallucinations. And so we were hearing God because our non-dominant hemisphere was talking to us via an epilepsy phenomena, essentially. So I think that we spend a lot of time in a linear environment. We're solving problems, we're watching TV, we're being sold to, we're fighting, we're getting money, we're consuming. It's very linear. It's a very transactional way to be. And kind of like, think about all of us who sit at desks and we're in this cashew shape, all curled up all the time.
Right.
And then we find that kettlebells and yoga become super important because of the opposite, because they pull the body out and they teach the posterior chain to become really powerful so that you're not always curled up in a fetal position as a human. And I think that the ecstatic stuff becomes important for those of us for whom we are curled up in a linear position, to butcher the metaphor, where we're always in that like non-spiritual, non-abstract, non-nuanced, non-emotional, not aware state. Some education, some irrigation of those tissues, of those abilities, can give people a lot of more rich human experience, but also as a place to go to do healing, to release trauma, to release crap. Mercedes Eliade, who described shamanism, talked about the shaman goes to extraordinary reality and then comes back to ordinary reality. But again, the problem is harvest, coming back with insight, especially because a lot of the things we use historically to get to those states are very altering. If you're doing your combo or your ayahuasca or your, heroic dose of LSD or something, yeah, you're going to have an experience, but are you going to be present enough to to learn from it? Or is it going to be like, wow, I had a cool experience 2 days ago. Well, I know I learned something. And if you do something that's not completely distorting, but gets you some of the same access, which can be dance, meditation with absorption practices, not awareness, like simple mindfulness, but like concentration, absorption practices, neurofeedback, intense exercise. I would argue if you're a musician, playing music at a high level with other people becomes one of those things as well, because it's a rich, nonlinear communication that you're just participating in instead of, deciding how it goes. And I think these are really important things that we may underemphasize in this modern Western linear world.
Yeah.
So
what are some of the ways, I mean, I know you mentioned a few, but what are some of the ways that you recommend accessing those states on a more regular basis?
Well, if there's things in the way, then do neurofeedback and get those out of the way. But generally, I'm a big fan of the basics. All the ancient stuff we've been told for 5,000, 10,000 years, guess what? It works. So it doesn't take a lot, though. You don't have to become a monk or a guru on a mountaintop to have your shit together. You can, there is a middle road. So meditation or yoga, and yoga being a form of meditation, really. I think meditation's about the most underutilized tool set that we have and we're basically born with. Just the act of anchoring the intention in a voluntary way and then coming back to the same anchor again and again. That's what meditation is. So I think that among the most powerful things any human could do would be to develop a morning routine. I call it a minimal viable practice, an MVP, where you hit the can, brush your teeth, and then do a 5 or 10-minute self-care ritual. If it's a lot, if it feels like a burden, it's too much. It should not be, oh, I have to go work out. It should be like, okay, I just naturally move from brushing my teeth into my 5 sun salutations, or walking the dog to that place in the corner that's a little farther away, or, ooh, my wife loves tea from a place that's a quarter mile away. I'm going to go get that every day. Like, find that ritual, the movement, and a little bit of activity before food, before caffeine, before stressing in that moment, because in the morning you're woken up by blood sugar and cortisol. So it's a circadian event. You want to burn off the cortisol and blood sugar before calling for any more. Otherwise, you're just trying to slam things into receptors that have recently been occupied. So this is why, the biohackers say to wait an hour for your coffee. It's to let the cortisol burn off naturally so that you actually feel the increased cortisol from that when you take it again. So I think the morning routine is about the number one thing people should be finding a way to construct a supportive morning strategy.
Beautiful. Andrew, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I could always go like 1,000 different ways with you. I mean, we didn't get into any of the, West African drumming and some of the other crazy things I know that you've been up to. One question I always ask all my guests at the end of the show is just, what's one question that you would have for the audience that might change their perspective or have them think about something in a different way?
I would say, a question posed to the audience, I would say, how different would your life be if you had control over your sleep, your attention, or your stress? The 3 legs of the stool: sleep, strength, sleep, attention, and stress. If one of those things is really out of whack, how different would it be to get it under control? Because it actually isn't that hard for most of the big resources. So don't tolerate it. Shift happens. Get yours. Get some shift.
Beautiful. Andrew, this has been awesome. Thanks again for coming on the show. We'll have you back on some other time.
Of course. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.